So philosophical perspectives on consciousness. Yeah, so consciousness, what is consciousness? So on the one hand, it is, well, there's nothing we know better than consciousness in a sense, right? Because everything I experience happens in my consciousness. My entire life is my consciousness in a sense. Nobody can, well, at least ordinarily, transcend their own consciousness. That is impossible for us. So on the one hand, there's nothing that we are better acquainted with or to than our own consciousness, right? But it turns out that it is not that easy to define in a more precise way, to make it a kind of a specific definition. Probably the most common definition is I am conscious, or a thing is conscious if there is something it is like to be that thing. So there is something it is like to be me, therefore I am conscious. There was a paper titled "What is it like to be a bat?" And the idea here is that it is very difficult, or perhaps probably impossible, for us to imagine what it really is like to be a bat, right? We use our vision and our as a primary sense of understanding the world, but a bat does it in a entirely different way. So what is it like to be a bat? We don't know, and we can't even imagine it, but still there is something it is like to be a bat. The bat is experiencing in some way, perhaps entirely different from the way we are experienced, but it still has experiences. So therefore the bat is conscious. So loosely speaking here, consciousness is equated with experience, or experiencing, perhaps. So this is not like self-consciousness or being able to reflect or intelligence. It's simply experiencing. So in this way of understanding consciousness, the human being, of course, and higher animals, and perhaps even I don't know if it's called lower animals as well, but animals would possess consciousness as well. So that's kind of the general idea. And in the philosophy of mind, both in contemporary philosophy and also historically, the so-called mind-body problem has been the main issue, the main problem. And it concerns the relationship between the physical, the brain, and the mental or consciousness, the relationship between these two things, or kind of things, or historically between body and soul. And there are, historically, there are four main positions on the fundamental nature of reality, and each of them provides a different answer, perhaps, to this problem here, or at least a different perspective on the problem. So this is Descartes. In the 16th century, he advocated the position of dualism, or substance dualism, more precise. And the idea here is that both the physical and the mental, or consciousness, both are fundamental. So it's not that consciousness, for example, is dependent on the physical in order to exist. They both exist fundamentally. The physical exists in itself, and the mental, or consciousness, exists in itself. And that's why it's dualism, right? There are two basic substances, or two basic types of things. So historically, the body and the soul both exist independently of each other. But this position faces the so-called interaction problem. So consciousness and the physical world, they are very different from each other. They are perhaps the two most different things that we know about at all. So physical objects, they can be measured. They have a weight and a certain length, perhaps, and they are objective in the sense that we can all access them. So I can see a hand here and you can see the same hand, right? So we can agree that there's a hand here. But on the other hand, what happens? Well, the mental life is not accessible in the same way. It's not. It's subjective. What happens in my mind is for me alone to experience. Nobody else has access to it. And a thought, it doesn't weigh anything, or it doesn't have any length. The neural correlate, perhaps what happens in the brain can be measured, but the thought itself, or an idea or a feeling, it's in itself, it doesn't have any physical properties. We can't measure it in any way, and it's purely subjective. So there seems to be very few, perhaps no, shared properties here. So these two substances, these two things are very, very different. So how do they interact? So clearly they interact in some way. If I, in my mind, in my consciousness, I decide I want to raise my right hand, and then suddenly my right hand is raised, right? So a mental, well, a thought, something happening in my consciousness seems to cause something happening in the physical world. So there's some kind of causal relationship here. And similarly, if I suffer brain damage, then it might lead to some unwanted effects in my mental life, right? So there seems to be some kind of interaction. And how to explain this interaction then? Because usually we would say, well, a physical effect requires a physical cause. These two things are so different. How would they be able to interact? And this problem, this interaction problem, Descartes, he faced it, and it's still present today, and there are not any good solutions to this. And today, this is not a much advocated position. Right? This is it's rarely seen advocated in contemporary philosophy. But according to dualism or substance dualism, then consciousness exists independently of the physical world. This is Spinoza, a 17th century Dutch philosopher, and he, partly in response to Descartes' dualistic position, he presented this so-called double aspect theory. And the view here is that the physical and the mental or consciousness are two aspects of an underlying reality or substance. And he uses a coin to illustrate this concept. So he says, all right, if I look at the coin from one side, it has certain properties. It looks in a certain way. And then if I flip the coin like this, and I look at it from this side instead, it looks different. It has different properties, but it's still the same coin. So I can look at it from here or from here, but it's still the same coin, even though it looks different, or there are different properties that are displayed. And he would say that's how reality fundamentally is ordered, or that's the fundamental nature of reality. Consciousness and the physical are two aspects of the same fundamental reality. We just think they are two entirely different things or different substances. But this position faces challenges as well. So it is claimed that there exists some fundamental reality or substance or thing, but it's rather obscure because it's something that can be consciousness and the physical world simultaneously, right? It's something that can be both mental and physical at once. So what is this strange substance or thing? There's one philosopher he said it's like having something that can be a circle and at the same time a square. How can that? Well, it's impossible that it can be both at the same time, right? And yeah, indeed, today, at least in its pure form as presented by Spinoza, it is not a much advocated theory either. Right? It's too obscure and it's too far away from this materialistic view that you mentioned, Mary. Because the third position, this is materialism, or sometimes called physicalism. That's roughly the same thing. And this position claims that, at least in the Western world, this is the most widespread position, but it claims that what is fundamental is the physical. So only the physical exists in itself. Reality is physical basically. And consciousness or the mental is, in a sense, created by the physical. So because of certain processes in the brain and chemical reactions and electrical impulses, consciousness is somehow created, or it arises in a sense from the physical. So only the physical exists, and the mental is a product of the physical, of what's happening in the brain. Materialism faces some challenges as well, and the most pressing problem perhaps is the so-called hard problem of consciousness. So there was I think he was Australian philosopher, perhaps David Chalmers, he coined this term, and he said, okay, we have the easy problems of consciousness. So neuroscience attempts to map the brain. They look for correlations between what happens in the brain or in specific areas of the brain, and then what happens in consciousness or in the content of consciousness. So they look for correlations between neural states or brain states and mental states. So they will say, all right, if something happens in this region or this part of the brain, then this stuff happens in our consciousness. And if something happens here, then this stuff happens instead. So they attempt to map out the entire brain. And Chalmers, he said, okay, it's perhaps not that easy, but it's, at least in principle, it sounds fair to assume that at some point we'll get this understanding, that we'll understand the brain in great detail, right? So we will have mapped out the brain. That's the easy problem. But then he says that still doesn't explain why consciousness or experience even exists in the first place. Why do certain electrical impulses and chemical reactions, how can they create consciousness? There's an explanatory gap between understanding the way the brain is operating or working, and then explaining the existence of consciousness. So why does consciousness even exist, and how does it come into existence? So he argues that you cannot. We are faced with this problem, and materialism seems unable to handle this problem. And there are no generally accepted theories on this today in contemporary philosophy. How can something presumably non-conscious, or as atoms and neurons, how can they be conscious, or how can they generate consciousness? So there's a big gap here. that nobody can explain. So that's the primary concern in contemporary philosophy of mind for the last century or so. People have attempted to solve this problem, but there are no good explanations at the moment, at least. So this is not one of the four main positions, but in recent years, last decade or two, the position of panpsychism has gained a bit of traction. This is a quite controversial position, but partly due to the problem of explaining consciousness, some philosophers have looked in other directions for solutions to this problem. So the idea in panpsychism is that consciousness is present, it's ubiquitous, it's present all over and everywhere. It's not something that's produced by the mind, but it is everywhere. It's an old concept, but in contemporary philosophy, it is, well, yes, controversial, as I mentioned. In contemporary philosophy, it's usually framed in the way that the fundamental physical units are considered to possess consciousness, if such units even exist. So consciousness, in some perhaps very rudimentary sense. So it's not that they have a conscious life like we do, but consciousness or experience in some form, or proto-consciousness, something in that direction. Because then we don't have to explain how the physical can generate consciousness. Consciousness is fundamental. It's a fundamental property of matter, or at least of some fundamental physical units, perhaps. It's not something that arises. It's something that is there to begin with. This is rather controversial that, well, it's not even atoms perhaps, but some even smaller fundamental particles or units should possess consciousness in some form or shape. But it has gotten some traction, as I mentioned, and it's not considered quite as crazy as it was perhaps 20 years ago. It does face its own problems, though, especially the so-called combination problem. So the idea is that my physical body, it consists of these fundamental physical units, and they are combined or arranged in a certain way. So I have my body, and they make up my body in some way. So the idea here is that we have small individual units of consciousness, and they combine, and thereby my consciousness is created, or they ground my consciousness. So my consciousness exists because of these small consciousnesses, or minds, micro minds, you might say. But I have in my consciousness is linked perhaps to one perspective. I have my very own perspective, and each of you have your own perspectives. So there's only one perspective linked to a single consciousness, or a single subject, you might say. Perspectives, they cannot be cut in half, or they can't be merged either. I have my own subjective sphere of experience. I have my own perspective that is strictly mine. So how can all these individual minds or consciousnesses, how can their perspectives be combined into a single unified perspective, my perspective? So at least on the assumption that perspectives cannot combine, this seems very hard to explain. So panpsychism, contemporary panpsychism, is faced with the so-called combination problem. And so this very in the strain of panpsychism here, it's linked pretty closely to materialism, right? The fourth of the main views or positions regarding the fundamental nature of reality is idealism. And idealism is materialism in its inverse form, in a way, because materialism claims that what exists fundamentally is the physical, and consciousness or the mental arises from the physical in some unknown way. According to idealism, it is the mental that is fundamental. So our experience is fundamental. It's not the physical world that exists and causes consciousness to exist. It's the other way around. So the physical, what we experience as a physical object, is simply an experience. There's no external physical world. So when I experience a hand here, there's no hand out there that causes me to experience this hand. And there are different strains of idealism as well. So according to one, subjective idealism, it is merely a perception. There is no hand, there's no external reality, there's nothing except my experience. So this hand only exists as a perception or as an experience in my mind. There's nothing out there. That's rather crazy, perhaps. Then there are other strains that would say, okay, there is an external reality. It is not a physical reality, but there is something out there. There is, in a sense, an objective or an external reality. There is something out there. And all of our experiences are appearances of this external fundamental reality. It appears to us in a certain way. So when I look at my hand or anything else, all of the physical objects or even thoughts perhaps, it's the external reality that appears to me in a certain way. So it's idealism in the sense that there is no physical world out there, but there's something that appears to us as the physical world. So idealism, especially the first strain of idealism I mentioned, the subjective idealism, it contradicts common sense heavily, right? All right, there's no hand, there's nothing there. I only experienced a hand. It sounds somewhat crazy. So perhaps you don't even exist, right? I only have images of you in my mind, but you're not even there. There's no external reality. It also lacks objective underpinning in the sense that there's no hand out there. There's only my experience of a hand. So if I close my eyes, I don't see the hand anymore. So now the hand doesn't exist because I don't see it. I don't have any perception of a hand in my head. And then I open my eyes, and then the hand, it springs back into existence. But it's precisely the same. It's looking the same way. It's the same spot in space where I left it when I closed my eyes, right? Well, how can that be? Because there's nothing out there. There's nothing that structures my appearances in this, or my perceptions in any way, right? And if it's just a thought, or if it's only in my head, why can't I then just move my hand through it? It's not physical, right? So, okay, it's a bit crazy, but there are some serious problems with this variant of idealism, and almost nobody in contemporary philosophy advocate this view, right? Cosmopsychism is somewhat similar to panpsychism, but it's turned upside down in a way. So the strain of panpsychism I mentioned claimed that the fundamental physical units, the very smallest physical particles perhaps, possess consciousness in some very rudimentary form perhaps, and then they are combined, and that's what is, and it's due to these microminds that my consciousness exists. Cosmopsychism is the inverse view. The claim here is that the entire universe or the entire cosmos is conscious, or is a single, undivided, and all-encompassing consciousness. There are various forms. Well, that is, of course, even more controversial than some of the other positions I mentioned. It does share some similarities with some of the traditional Eastern religious views, for example, Buddhism and Hinduism, perhaps. But it's very controversial in contemporary philosophy. Almost, there are a few that take this position seriously and debate it and write papers on it. But it's only a few. But it does exist as a proper philosophical position. The position of cosmopsychism, it can be oriented toward materialism, but it can also be oriented toward idealism, as I mentioned idealism before. So here, the entire universe possesses consciousness, and consciousness is fundamental. So there's no physical universe. There's an appearance of this underlying consciousness or substance that possesses consciousness. It appears to us as the entire physical world, as the entire universe, right? So everything is one, as I mentioned. And the individual minds, my consciousness exists in virtue of this fundamental consciousness or entity, or this substance or something that possesses consciousness. So we don't have to explain where does consciousness come from. How can the physical world generate consciousness in a way? Because consciousness is fundamental. The mental is fundamental here. It's because of this underlying or fundamental consciousness or conscious reality that I, as an individual subject, conscious subject, even exist. So my consciousness is grounded in this universal consciousness. But then we face the combination problem in its inverse form, the so-called decombination problem, because how do we explain then that this single, unified, all-encompassing consciousness that presumably has one single undivided perspective, as I mentioned, how can it be divided or differentiated into all these individual consciousnesses, into all these individual subjects? How can we consistently claim the existence of independent subjects and a single, all-encompassing, undivided consciousness? That's the big problem for contemporary cosmopsychism. So Martinus, arguably, he can be, I don't know, identified or classified as representing the cosmopsychistic view, that his world picture is a variant of cosmopsychism, an idealistic cosmopsychism on top of that, perhaps. And he presents with his triunic understanding of the living being, of the subject, he presents an interesting answer to this decombination problem, but perhaps we can talk about that later. So I think Martinus, he fits, generally at least, he fits the idealistic cosmopsychistic position. Yeah. Okay, so consciousness, what is it? So it heavily depends on which of these four metaphysical positions one ascribed to. So according to dualism or substance dualism, both the physical and consciousness exist independently of each other. So consciousness or the mind or the soul perhaps can exist independently of the physical. It's not created or generated by the brain. According to this double aspect theory, there's one obscure fundamental reality, and consciousness and the physical are two aspects or two sides of this fundamental reality. According to materialism, by far the most widespread position in contemporary philosophy today, consciousness somehow, in some unexplained way, depends on what happens in the brain. So no brain or no brain processes no consciousness, right? But we still can't really get the grasp of this. There's an explanatory gap here. We can't explain where does consciousness, or how does it originate from the brain. It's a big problem, the hard problem of consciousness. Big problem for the materialist position. All right, I mentioned panpsychism, the idea that consciousness is everywhere, that even the smallest particles have consciousness, possess consciousness in some strange way, but it's a controversial position, as I mentioned. And then we have idealism, where consciousness is the fundamental substance of reality. It is because of consciousness that the physical exists, and it exists only in the sense that we experience things as physical objects. There's no physical external reality. There's no physical world out there. Perhaps there's nothing, or perhaps there's something out there that appears to us as the physical world. But here consciousness is fundamental. It's simply that which is, in a sense, right? Or that which is possesses consciousness. And within this consciousness or this mind, all of our experiences happens, including our experiences of the physical world. But they are merely experiences. Yeah, and then there was this position of cosmopsychism, that the entire cosmos possesses consciousness, one all-encompassing, undivided consciousness, then that our individual consciousnesses or minds are in some way grounded in this universal consciousness. Okay, so what is consciousness? Well, there's no generally accepted answer. Most philosophers, they operate within the framework of materialism, but they're having a very hard time explaining what it is. So it's possible to describe various aspects of consciousness, but what it fundamentally is, and how it even comes into existence, well, there are no good theories for that. Yes, so that was a bit about consciousness from a philosophical perspective, like basic philosophical perspective.